Peter, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, Peter, I want to discuss your new book. It's coming out tomorrow, titled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. This book talks about the moral and ethical things that you grapple with as a Jewish person, given what has happened in Gaza and your take on how Jews should respond, how Israel should respond. Something else you've talked about in the past is the idea that Israel claims both to be a Jewish state and a democracy. I think you believe those things are in contradiction. I don't necessarily see them as a contradiction, but can you help me understand why you think that being a democratic state contradicts being a Jewish state?
Sure. Yeah. Nice to be with you. So
Yeah.
I think a fundamental principle of liberal democracy is the principle of equality under the law. Now, the people are always going to have different economic circumstances, but that the law should treat people equally, irrespective of their race, religion, ethnicity. A Jewish state means a state that has a special obligation towards the interests of one particular, let's say, ethno-religious group, Jews, right? And so that gives Jews legal supremacy in a way that violates equality under the law, which I think is a core principle of the liberal democracy. So you can see that in the most extreme form in the West Bank, where Jews and Palestinians live under a totally different legal system, where Jews have citizenship, they have due process, they have free movement, and they have the right to vote for the Israeli state, whereas Palestinians, even though they live under the control of the Israeli state, don't have citizenship, don't have the right to vote, need military permission to travel freely, and live under a military court system where the prosecution rate is 99%. But even among the minority of Palestinians under Israeli control who do have citizenship, who we sometimes call Arab Israelis, their citizenship is far from equal. Israel has a legally segregated school system in which Palestinians go to segregated and not coincidentally inferior schools, right? So we would not have thought that Black Americans who went to segregated and legally inferior schools were equal citizens, even though they were citizens of the United States. Also, Israeli land law, 93% or so of the land inside Israel proper, I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza now, but Israel proper and East Jerusalem, is controlled by something called the Israel Land Authority, which gives almost half its seats to the Jewish National Fund, whose mission is to develop land for the use of Jews, not all of Israel's citizens, which is why Palestinian cities and towns are so much more overcrowded than Jewish ones.
A couple of questions I have on that.
Yeah.
You're saying that Israel gives Jews legal supremacy under the law?
Yes.
But isn't it the case that there's Israeli citizens, many of whom are Jews, some of whom are non-Jews, and it's my understanding that Israel's legal system applies equally to all citizens, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. So you have Jews, Arabs, Palestinians, Druze, and other minorities who have the same civil and legal rights under Israeli law. Is that not true?
No, I don't think that's true. Again, first of all, it's important to remember that most of the Palestinians under Israeli control are not citizens and cannot be citizens, those in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, East Jerusalem, also most Palestinians are not citizens in East Jerusalem either, although they can apply for citizenship. There's a minority of Palestinians under Israeli control who are citizens. We sometimes call them Arab Israelis, right? And so they do have citizenship and they can vote and they are represented in the Knesset. And there are even Palestinian citizens on Israel's Supreme Court. But it is a very second-class form of citizenship for the reasons I mentioned. Again, you have a legally segregated school system, for instance, and there are Jewish institutions like the Jewish National Fund, which operate for the benefit only of Jews, that have tremendous power within Israel's governmental system. Imagine if most of the public land in America was controlled in large measure by an institution that only developed that land for the benefit of Christians. Would American Jews feel equal?
I guess not. But isn't it? But you're saying they don't have equal laws within Israel proper itself? Like
yes, yes.
Don't Arab Israelis have the right to vote, hold office, access public services?
They do, although even that is somewhat circumscribed, because under Israeli law, you are not actually allowed to register a political party unless that political party supports the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. So most Palestinian citizens don't really support Israel as a Jewish state. Why would they? Right? It confines them to a legal status. So what happens when the Palestinian political parties, like Balad, for instance, try to register in Israeli elections? They're regularly denied the right to register by the Israeli Election Commission. That has been historically overturned by the Israeli Supreme Court, although I'm not sure that will continue. So it's just another example of the way in which a state that defines itself as a Jewish state does not treat its non-Jewish citizens equally, let alone its non-Jewish non-citizens.
But they can vote, right? Like they can hold positions of power in the government, right?
Yes, well, it's interesting you say positions of power, right? Because Palestinian citizens can vote. So there are Palestinian parties in the Knesset, and there even have been some Palestinian cabinet ministers, right? And then under the previous governor Naftali Bennett, there was even a Palestinian party, Ram, Mansour Abbas's party, which is in the government. But it is inconceivable in the Israel that exists today as a Jewish state that you could ever have a Palestinian prime minister or even a Palestinian in the security cabinet, which is to say Israeli security decisions are always made by Jews. And in fact, there's a general understanding in Israeli politics that you need a Jewish majority in the Knesset for a government to be legitimate. And this is the product of the entire ethno-nationalist identity of Israel as a state that has a superior obligation to Jews than the obligation it has to all of its citizens. Another example would be immigration policy, right? So any Jew can go to Israel and get citizenship on day one. But if you were a Palestinian who was born in Israel and who was expelled, you cannot return and gain citizenship in Israel.
But the idea that there's been a Palestinian in the Supreme Court of Israel and the Knesset, how do you reconcile that? I mean, they certainly have some rights. You're saying it's not equal.
Yes, that's exactly right. They have some rights, but they're not equal rights. I think that's exactly well put. Yes.
What Israel would say is that they do have full rights, which would be the right to vote, hold office. The Israeli Supreme Court has ruled in favor of non-Jews many times in many landmark cases.
Yeah, I think calling them non-Jews is the wrong phrase, right? These people have a national identity as Palestinians. Yeah. They're not just non-Jews. Yes, the Israeli support has at times limited what the government can do. But remember, the Palestinian citizens of the West Bank are not even citizens of the state. They live under military law, right? So they are not represented by the institutions of the Israeli state at all, nor are the Palestinians in Gaza, nor are most of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. It's a minority of the Palestinian citizens are the people who managed to not get expelled in 1948, and they do have some of these rights. I think one analogy we might think about is, let's think about America in 1950, right? In the status of Black Americans. Some Black Americans in the 1950s, those who lived in the North, had the right to vote, a minority of Black Americans. And then most Black Americans who lived in the South did not have the right to vote, right? But even the Black Americans in the North who had the right to vote, and there were Black people in Congress in the 1950s in the United States, were not equal citizens. There was a whole series of laws having to do with housing in the United States, for instance, or the application of the GI Bill in employment that basically discriminated against Black citizens, even in the North, which is why Martin Luther King ultimately ended up protesting in Chicago. And I think that's would be a rough analogy you might think about with Palestinians in Israel.
And then you also mentioned the West Bank. So Palestinians in the West Bank, they're not Israeli citizens, right? Because
they can't be,
right? But residents of the Palestinian territories govern under, so that they're governed under like a complex legal framework, right? It's both Israeli military rule and the PA, and so that distinction is not based on ethnicity or religion, but rather the political status and sovereignty stemming from the conflict itself, like with Israel and Palestine. So the Palestinians are subject to that legal framework due to a lack of like an ultimate status agreements and ongoing disputes over sovereignty more so than race and ethnicity. Would you agree?
No, I wouldn't say. I would say that ethnicity, however you call Jewishness and Palestinianness, are central, right? A Jew, anywhere they live in the West Bank, is a citizen of the state of Israel, right? And then has full rights as a citizen of that state. Palestinians are stateless. They don't have citizenship. Now, what they have is they are ruled. There are different forms of, I would say, basically, Israel governs the entirety of the West Bank completely, right? The Israeli army and the army of no other country can go into any square inch of the West Bank and arrest anyone they want, anytime they want. But Israel chooses to administer the West Bank, the Palestinians in the West Bank, in different ways. So in the Area C, for instance, which is 60% of the West Bank, Israel governs Palestinians directly. In the Palestinian population centers, which are in areas A and B, Israel doesn't want to run the schools there or pick up the garbage. So they give the Palestinian Authority the authority to do that. But the Palestinian Authority itself is under the control of the state of Israel. If Israel, there are lots of elected members of the Palestinian parliament who are in Israeli jails.
And I guess, like, are you against the idea of a Jewish state full stop? Like, do you think that Jews have the right to self-determination and to have a state of their own?
I don't think that self-determination and a state of one's own are the same thing. Self-determination means, just think about the term, it means determination of the self, right? So I, as an individual, have the right to self-determination, but it doesn't give me the right to tell you what to do, right? And so when you're talking about a territory like Israel and Palestine, which is roughly 50% Palestinian and 50% Jewish, right? Jews have the right to determine themselves, but they don't have the right to determine Palestinians, right? So if there were no Palestinians there, then there would be no problem with a Jewish state, Jews determining themselves. But in reality, what's happening is that Jews are not just determining their own fate, but they're determining the fate of Palestinians as well, right? So that's why I think a better term than self-determination is Jewish supremacy. I think there are forms of self-determination that can be expressed as autonomy, right, without supremacy. So I would, in my utopia, Israel-Palestine would be an equal binational state, and we could imagine that Jewish communities would be able to have schools that ran primarily in Hebrew as a form of self-determination, but not as a form of legal supremacy where they have rights over the other group of people.
And then within Israel, you're saying that non-Jews have inferior rights. Can you help me explain that? Sorry, can you help me understand that? Because the legal system the laws I've seen in Israel
Right.
seem to apply across the board to all citizens of Israel. Where is
Well,
that?
they apply to everyone, but they treat those people equally, so differently.
Unequal.
So,
How
as
so?
I said, you have a legally segregated school system, right? You do not have Palestine. I mean, there are a few private schools where Palestinians and Israeli Jews could go to schools, but in general, if you are a Palestinian, you go to a separate Palestinian school system, and then there are three main Jewish school systems based on how religious you are, right? And so this is again, for an American, this would seem pretty simple, right? If you are categorizing people because of their ethnic and religious group, they're going to a separate school system, right? And those school systems have been chronically underfunded, right? Don't have the same resources that Jewish schools do. That's an expression of your lack of legal equality, right? Even to take just like another example, the Israeli.
Can I ask you about segregation though, just to pull this thread here? So I know that there's Hebrew-speaking schools,
Mhm.
and then there's also Arab-speaking schools. Now, presumably, a Jewish person would not want to go to an Arab-speaking school, and likewise, if you are Palestinian or Arab, I can't imagine you would. It would make sense that it wouldn't be automatic that you would go to a Hebrew-speaking school. Like, is there a sense in which there is a natural delineation because of culture and preferences for
Why
language?
should there? I mean, why should there be? I mean, this is a state in which two national languages are spoken, Hebrew and Arabic, right? Why shouldn't people just be able to? Why shouldn't you have a public school system which allows people to go to whatever school they want?
Are they
right?
forced to? Are they choosing to? Or are they forced to go?
Forced to. I
They
mean,
are.
Palestinians live under. Another example would be in terms of land. The reason that Palestinian municipalities, where Palestinians are majority, are dramatically overcrowded compared to Jewish municipalities, right? The reason is the Israel Land Authority, which controls most of the land in Israel and doles that land out to municipalities for their expansion, doesn't give majority Palestinian municipalities more land to grow. That's why Palestinian towns are so much more overcrowded. So that's another form of this legal inferiority.
That's a separate topic. The question of segregation.
But it's a state institution.
But I am really interested in the school segregation. Is there a law or policy in Israel that mandates separate schooling? Because you're comparing it to like black and white segregation in the U.S.
Yes. Under law, there are different segregated school systems. Now, if a Palestinian...
That's not true according to my research. So according to my research at least, and I could be wrong, there is no law or policy in Israel that mandates separate schooling for Jewish and Arab students.
You think all the Palestinians are just going to these overcrowded, inferior Palestinian schools because they don't have the opportunity to go to other schools? I mean,
I could be wrong. I'm just telling you. I'm personally not aware, and I could be wrong. I'm not aware of any law that I was under the impression that it was because of linguistic and cultural identity decisions to go to one school.
I don't think that if you asked Palestinian citizens of Israel whether they want to go to segregated and legally substandard and educationally substandard schools, they would say yes.
No, that
Right.
right. No one wants to. No one would intentionally go
Right.
to a substandard school.
Right.
I'm not.
Right.
I'm not say. I don't mean to, and I guess I am implying that. So I don't mean to imply that. But what I also mean to say at the same time is that there doesn't seem to be a law that exists, as far as I'm aware, or that you're aware, that legally segregates the schools.
It,
So
it may
maybe the answer's in the middle. Like
it
maybe
may
there's
be it may
nuance.
be this is just you're right. Maybe it's just longstanding administrative policy that existed since 1948. Let's also remember that between 1948 and 1966, the Palestinian citizens lived under military law. They literally could not even stay overnight outside of their villages, the majority of them, without military permission. So this is the context in which the Palestinian school system was created in a condition of military Palestinian citizens held under military law.
Yeah. Um, I also mentioned, so that in the U.S. we have private religious schools
Sure.
which serve specific communities. That is
Sure.
somewhat of an analogy to Israel. Their
But these
government
are
does
state
fund.
government. These are government schools. They're not private
So
schools.
are the Arab schools in Israel. So the Arab schools in Israel, I believe, are funded by the government. Who else would be?
Right. But my point is, right, in the United States, right, you can have a Catholic school and you can have private schools. And there are a small number of non-government schools in Israel that have both, like the hand-in-hand schools which have Jewish and Palestinian populations. But the vast majority of students go to government schools, right, that are essentially either 100% Palestinian or 100% Jewish.
Got it. I want to ask you about your book, Peter, that is coming out tomorrow, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. So what is this book about? What does it mean to be Jewish after the destruction of Gaza?
Well, to me, the book is about why it is that the organized American Jewish community, I think, tells a story about what it means to be Jewish that has prevented, I think, the community, the organized community, from facing, I think, some very harsh realities about what Israel has done in Gaza, and indeed about the structure of Israeli control over Palestinians in general. And it argues that the relationship between the organized American Jewish community and Israel has many of the features of idolatry, of worship of a state, that I think actually Jewish tradition is really very critical of.
And what compelled you to write the book? Like what was it like for you in the wake of past October 7th? What has, like, how have you felt about this war in the last year and a half?
I think to me, it's been a very disorienting experience. I mean, first of all, there was the horror of October 7th itself, which was unbelievably traumatic and kind of a day that I think we're still living in the wreckage of that day. Obviously, also not just because of the people who were killed, but also because of the people who still remain as hostages. But then, in response to that, very quickly, Israel launches an assault on Gaza that I think it was not hard to understand was very likely to lead to virtually the destruction of the entire society. And so now we see that most of the buildings are destroyed, most of the hospitals, most of the schools, most of the agriculture, that the basis of life has largely been destroyed. The number of children who've been killed dwarfs the number of children who've been killed in Ukraine. The UN recently said that Gaza has more child amputees than any society in modern history. And I think that, to me, what was so disorienting and troubling, and the reason I wrote the book, was that I saw the institutions of American Jewish life, which are my institutions. I mean, I live Jewish institutions structure my life in very fundamental ways. And I saw many people in my own community, people who I care about, were essentially justifying this. They might have said it was unfortunate, but they justified it. And to me, there's something fundamentally wrong about that. I felt like the horror of what Israel was doing was not actually impacting people in the way that was allowing them to be their best selves.
And you talk about Jewish leaders turning solidarity into a, as you say, moral sedative.
Yes.
Do you have any personal experiences that pushed you to move beyond that narrative and publicly challenge it?
Sure. I mean, I guess my own views on this question more generally about Israel and Palestine have really been shaped a lot by the time that I spent with Palestinians in the West Bank and now beyond. I know, have a number of friends who are from Gaza, Palestinians from different places. And I think that um, I grew up in a Jewish environment, which is probably fairly typical, in which there was really no real interaction with Palestinians. I had a very I had a clear understanding of what Israel meant to Jews, what it meant to my family, why it was so important. And Israeli society is still very important to me. Israeli Jewish society is very important to me. But I didn't have an interaction with Palestinians. I went to Israel many times as a kid, quite a few times, and had and was very, very, really, really loved being there. I still love being there. But I didn't go to the West Bank to spend time with Palestinians until I was in my 30s. And on the first day that I was in the West Bank spending time with Palestinians, I realized there was so much that I did not know. That was about the way the Israeli state treated the 50% of its people who are not Palestinian. I mean, who are not Jewish. Sorry.
And what did you see? What did you see?
I mean, as we were just saying, Palestinians in the West Bank live under the authority of the Israeli state, which is to say the state has essentially life and death power over them, but they aren't citizens. And they can't vote for the Israeli government. So what that means is the state is not accountable to them. They don't have rights vis-a-vis the state. And the only thing that I think gives any of us protection against a state, states are inherently violent entities, right? They have armies, right? The only thing that protects us is the fact that we have certain rights that limit what the state can do to us. But that doesn't exist in the West Bank, right? So essentially, if you are a Jew, you're a Jew and a Jewish kid and a Palestinian kid both throw a stone at an Israeli soldier, right? The Jewish kid will go to a civil court where he has due process, right? The Palestinian kid will go into a military court system where the prosecution rate is north of 99%, where you can be held in indefinite detention, right? And where according to studies that I've seen that there's a physical abuse is quite common, right? And so this is the experience. If the Israeli state wants to take your land, there's really nothing you can do about it, right? Because you're not represented in the political system in the way your Jewish neighbors are. It's not totally dissimilar to why was life so shitty for Black Americans under Jim Crow in the South? It was because you had white and Black people there, but whites were represented by the state and Blacks weren't. So in every encounter between white and Black Southerners, basically Black people lost. And if whatever white people wanted to do to them, essentially they could do. And that's really the situation that Palestinians find themselves in the West Bank.
In your book, Peter, you delve into Jewish holidays and scriptures, and you point out how stories of Jewish suffering have omitted or downplayed the suffering of others. So are you critical of Judaism or the Jewish stories? Or
No. Quite the reverse. My argument is actually that I think our tradition, in all of its richness and complexity, describes Jews in the full range of our human capacities, right? As victims and also as victimizers. But the way very often in contemporary American Jewish culture, we talk about these holidays kind of erases part of that story and only imagines us in one role. So I for instance, talk about the book of Esther, which we would read on the holiday of Purim, right? So the book of Esther is a story in which this political leader rises, Haman, and he wants to kill all the Jews of Persia, right? Of this entire empire based in Persia, right? And through a series of maneuvers by Queen Esther, the Jews are saved. And that's often generally the way in which the story of the book of Esther is told, right? Is a story of in which Jews survive an attempted genocide. And that's true. But the book of Esther actually ends, right, with Mordecai, right, the Jewish leader, actually essentially the political power turns, right? And then there's a massacre of 75,000 people by Mordecai and the Jewish forces, right? So it also tells the story of what happens when Jews inflict tremendous violence on others. And my point is that our tradition actually gives us a more complex understanding of our relationship to the world than I think often the way we describe it in contemporary American Jewish life, in which basically in which Jews are imagined as a kind of permanent righteous victims.
How do you want America, the world, to see Jews? in light of this war? Like, what is the message that you want to deliver as a Jew
I,
living in America?
I think Jews are human beings. We have the right to be treated equally with all other human beings, and whatever country we live in, we should be treated equally, right? I think that's maybe an almost childlike statement, but that's my basic view, right? But part of that recognition of Jewish humanity is that recognizing that we are not immune, right, from abusing power and mistreating others, just like any other group of people, right? So that there's nothing about, even though Jews have been oppressed for much of our history, there's nothing about that experience of oppression that mean that Jews in Israel cannot turn around and oppress Palestinians, right? And I think one of the things that often happens in Jewish discourse is that we have a certain template for how we think about the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, right? So after October 7th happened, when October 7th happened, it was again and again, it was called a pogrom, right? In Jewish circles, right? Which is a kind of way of linking it to the violence that occurred against Jews in the Russian Empire in the late 19th and 20th century. But actually, the conditions were radically different in Israel-Palestine in 2023 than the conditions in the Russian Empire. Because in the Russian Empire, Jews were subservient, whereas in Israel-Palestine, Jews have legal supremacy. So if you want to understand what happened on October 7th and the horror of what happened on October 7th, you have to understand that the Jewish condition is completely different than it was in the Russian Empire during the time of pogroms.
In what way?
Again, because Jews were legally subservient in the Russian. They were the Jews were Europe's other. They were a group that has historically been discriminated against, including under the law. Whereas in Israel-Palestine, it's the reverse. It's Palestinians who are the legal inferiors, right? And Jews have legal supremacy. And so if you want to understand this terrible act of violence that Hamas committed on October 7th, you can't effectively understand that and try to make sure it never happens again if you don't recognize the conditions of legal supremacy that exist for Jews in Israel and Palestine. If you think it's a continuation of the Jewish experience in the 20th century in Europe, you're misunderstanding it.
Right. I see that. Yeah, that makes sense. And Peter, one question I want to ask you, Peter Beinart, is Trump was elected a few days ago.
Yes.
He has passed a ton of executive orders. He has given the 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. He has lifted the sanctions on the settlers in the West Bank.
Yes.
And he's now publicly saying that he wants to get all of the Palestinians out of Gaza, push them into Jordan or Egypt. Right. What do you make of all this?
I think it's horrifying. I mean, Palestinians, what Trump is saying about Gaza, it has a kind of Orwellian quality to it, right? He's saying it's terrible in Gaza. He said the place has been destroyed. So Egypt, or Jordan, you have to open your borders so these people can go to these places. Okay, well, how was it destroyed? Right? It was destroyed with our weaponry that we sent, that he wants to continue to send, right? So rather than destroying the place and saying it's destroyed, you need to go somewhere else, you need to leave the place that you're from, why not destroy it, right? Why not be open to rebuilding it? And beyond that, if you want to really be chutzpahdik about it, if you think that Palestinians shouldn't be in Gaza anymore because Gaza is too shitty, how about they get to go to the places they're from, right? Because most Palestinians in Gaza are not from Gaza, and they're not from Egypt, and they're not from Jordan. They're from what's now Israel. Most Gazans are from families that were expelled from Israel, right? Why should they not have the right to return to the lands from which their parents came?
And I certainly don't mean to steel man Trump's argument, but I wanted to pull out one thing you said, which is,
sure.
If you don't want to destroy Gaza, then stop destroying it. One thing Trump said is it already is destroyed.
Right, but why?
Because it's been destroyed through the war, through Israel, through the U.S., but that was before Trump got to office.
Okay, right, but he also, as you said, he wants to keep sending those 2,000-pound bombs, right? So we could say we're not going to send you any. We're going to condition our military aid on Israel adhering to, in terms of norms of kind of international legal norms about how you fight, and we're also going to say that that we're going to oppose that we're going to oppose the conditions of oppression that lock Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere into this condition where they don't have basic rights, right? That's not part of Trump's framework at all. Trump is basically, seems to me, to be quite comfortable with an act of advocating, actually an act of mass ethnic cleansing.
What do you think his end goal is, or what do you think will be the end result of all this?
I, it's hard, it's hard to get in the mind of Donald Trump. I mean, I think that I think there are people in Israel, in the Israeli government, who since the beginning of this, since after October 7th, have wanted basically to depopulate Gaza. So there was reporting in the Washington Post, I think, and elsewhere, that basically Netanyahu was trying to urge the U.S. and British leaders to try to pressure the Egyptians to open the border, right? And so there would be a kind of mass exodus into Egypt. And I think it's very unlikely that Israel would have allowed those people to return, given that Israel has never allowed Palestinian refugees to return, right? So I think this has always been part of it. I mean, from Israel's perspective, from the Israeli government's perspective, like, Palestinians in Gaza are a problem, right? They're a problem because they are fighting against Israel, right? And so how do you solve that problem? Well, one way would be to address their underlying grievances, which is the fact that they lack basic freedoms, right? But that's not really on the table in mainstream Israeli politics, certainly not this Israeli government, right? Another system would be to try to manage this system of oppression in which they don't have basic rights, but you're going to try to manage it with some new kind of government in Gaza. This is kind of what Biden wanted, like put the Palestinian Authority in play. But the Israeli government's not interested in that either, right? So where does that leave you? The Israeli government has said nothing about what kind of political structures they want in Gaza, right? And that's why I think that what people on the Israeli right say very explicitly, like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, which is essentially that we need to try to depopulate Gaza and also to resettle Israeli settlers there. For them, that's the way of solving the problem. If Palestinians are a problem, then if you have no Palestinians, or at least fewer Palestinians, you have less of a problem.
What do you think is going to happen? Do you have any idea? I mean, is Trump going to kick them all out of Gaza? Is that going to happen?
I mean, I don't know enough about. I know that Egypt has historically been very, very resistant to this because Egypt doesn't want a huge Palestinian refugee population in Egypt. For one thing, because they suspect, probably rightly, that these Palestinian refugees will organize themselves and fight against Israel, right? As Palestinian refugees have been doing since 1948 from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, which are where you have large Palestinian refugee populations. And so then what's going to happen? Israel's was going to go into Egypt to attack them. And Egypt sees that it's going to start getting bombed, right? Like some of other Israel's neighbors. And it's going to destroy the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement. So I think the Egyptians want none of this. I just don't know if they're strong enough to hold out because Egypt is very deeply in debt, right? They're very economically vulnerable. So I think it's possible that maybe Egypt will, and you'll have hundreds of thousands of people leaving. I also think it's possible that you'll just have a kind of ongoing, Israel will be going in and out of Gaza militarily for years, maybe decades, and the Palestinian population in Gaza will live in these conditions that are really subhuman conditions, right? I mean, I think I read that if you returned to the growth rate that Gaza had before October 7th, it would take something like 80 years to rebuild, to get back to the GDP that it had on October 7th. But it seems to me very little prospect that Israel would allow that. In fact, what Israel seems to be doing is wanting to force people in Gaza into an even smaller amount of territory and actually tighten the blockade.
And let's imagine you're the prime minister of Israel. They get Netanyahu out of there. They said, Peter, you're in. You want these Palestinians to be treated fairly. You know they deserve humanity and dignity. But as the prime minister of Israel, you're also worried about having, separate from the Palestinian population, you're worried about having Hamas terrorists and other terrorists on your border who have committed atrocities like October 7th, whose ideology they've stated explicitly commands them to repeat it over and over and over again. You take them at their word that they do want to continue massacring people in Israel. So how do you contend with that? How do you balance both the needs?
I think the problem in the way I would amend what you're saying, I do think it's true that Hamas leaders are saying we will commit further acts of violence, including violence against civilians, including potentially, horrifying acts like October 7th, right? But this is within a particular condition, right? A condition in which Palestinians live under apartheid and blockade, right?
That's what's under debate. So there's half of people are saying that. The other half of people are saying, no, jihadism is an ideology. There is no cause other than itself. It's not
Right,
about
but
oppression, and the evidence of that. And I'm not even taking a side here. I'm just
right,
saying the evidence
right.
of that is that you have jihadist groups in other parts of the world who do terrorist activity who are not oppressed by a government. 9/11 being an example, right? Like there was no cause and effect there.
Uh,
It was just
there-
jihadism.
no, I mean, I think it's important to make a very clear distinction between a justification and an explanation, right? An explanation is trying to understand why something happens. A justification is saying something is okay, right? So October 7th, there is no justifying October 7th. There was no justifying 9/11. But 9/11 had explanations, right? For instance, Al Qaeda was enraged that U.S. troops were on Saudi soil, right? So there was a cause for that,
Should we
right?
placate terror? Should we say, well, if we upset this group of people, they might terror? Like we can't.
No, no,
No
but
society is going to live in accordance with
no,
how do
but
we prevent? Well, how do we not anger terrorists? Like
no.
that's how societies are
If
going to.
you in if you want your people to be safe, right? It's not a good idea to, in my view, to inflict tremendous violence on people who live right next door to them, who are their neighbors, right? Because that system of violence, and when you deny people basic rights, you are inflicting huge amount of violence on them. That violence ultimately makes things less safe for everybody. There was if conditions where states where everyone has a voice in government tend to be more peaceful because people have the ability then to get the government to respond to them without having to take up arms. That's part of the reason that I think apartheid South Africa became safer when apartheid ended. It's part of the reason the United States is much safer than it would be if black people hadn't gotten the vote in 1965. I think Hamas's ideology of Islamism is fundamentally antithetical to my beliefs because it violates the principle of equality under the law. I don't believe in Islamic supremacy. I don't believe in Islamic states. I believe in states that treat everybody equally. The problem with thinking that Israel's fundamental problem is with Hamas is that Palestinians have been resisting and fighting against Israel since long before Hamas existed. Hamas was only created in 1987. If you think about the Palestinian armed resistance of the 1970s, some of it quite terrible, right? The Munich massacre at the Olympics in 1972, the Ma'alot massacre in northern Israel, the airplane hijackings. None of those people were Islamists. They were many of them were from leftist groups like the PFLP, kind of Marxist
But I
group.
feel like you're making my point stronger by saying, look,
No, I'm saying that that Islamism is not the reason Palestinians resist, because Palestinians have been fighting against Israel in violent and nonviolent ways.
and some Israelis would say it's anti-Semitism. They would say, why would you commit the Munich?
That's a different argument. I mean, or we can also point to Islamist groups that don't fight against Israel, right? I mentioned earlier Mansour Abbas and his Ram party, right, which joined Naftali Bennett's government. That's an Islamist party. Mansour Abbas is an Islamist.
Whether it's Islamist,
My point is that you can't explain Palestinian responses to Israel as a function of Islamism.
But you could explain it as but some of it, but to say, oh well, this terrorist wasn't a jihadist. What's your point? I mean, there's still
my point is that if Hamas ceased to exist and there were no more Palestinian Islamists and all the Palestinians were communists or secular nationalists, under conditions of oppression, you're still going to have Palestinians fighting against Israel, and indeed probably still fighting against Israel in ways that take Israeli lives, including civilian lives. If you want to try to make sure that isn't the case, I think you have to do two things. First of all, you have to you have to support Palestinian resistance, which is ethical, which doesn't take civilian life. If you shut down nonviolent mechanisms in which people struggle for freedom, you are making it more likely that you're going to have armed, unethical resistance against civilians. And if you give people basic rights, so they have a voice in government where they don't need to pick up a gun, then you're going to have much less violence. Why are Palestinian citizens less likely to take up armed resistance than Palestinian non-citizens in the West Bank and Gaza? I think it's partly because they have citizenship.
But here's where it breaks down for me a little bit. You're saying what seems obvious, which is if you oppress a group of people, they're going to fight back. Okay.
Yes.
But the other side of the argument would be, yeah, but there's some element of Hamas or Palestinians or whomever that think they deserve the entirety of Israel, and they have attacked Israel not just because of oppression. So an example of that is Israel's Gaza disengagement in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
Israel unilaterally, pronounce words.
Unilaterally,
Israel
yeah.
unilaterally, is that the word?
Yeah, yeah.
Withdrew all settlers and military forces from Gaza,
No,
ending direct occupation of the
it
territory.
didn't.
Despite that, rocket attacks from Gaza increased.
Right. But that's not true.
Right? Which
It's
part's
not
not
true.
true? Which part's
Israel did withdraw all its settlements, right? But it still maintained military control over Gaza, right? So for after the disengagement in 2005, for instance, Israel maintained a military buffer inside the Gaza Strip from which Palestinians were barred, where basically if you went up too near the fence, then basically you could be shot at. Israel maintained control over Gaza's coastline, over its airspace, over its population registry. You needed to be an Israeli computer system to come in and out of Gaza, and Israel controlled most of the land crossing. So essentially, the best way I think to think about what happens in Gaza after 2005 is that prison guards could leave the interior of a prison, but if they are still surrounding the prison on the perimeter, controlling all people and goods that come in and out, it's still a prison. It's not a territory that is free.
they got rid of their military. 8,000 settlers from Gaza, 21 settlements, withdrew all military forces. They no longer govern Gaza's
But they
daily
but
affairs.
they did no, but they still maintained control over Gaza.
Hmm.
I mean, if you can't come in and out of Gaza, right, without Israeli permission, right? If Israel's controlling the airspace and the coastline and most of the land borders and the very population registry itself, Israel still maintained control, just in a different way.
Got it. So you're saying it's whenever Palestinians attack Israel, it's always in response to Israeli aggression.
I don't think that. Look, again, when you say it that way, I don't justify Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians, not at all. But you can't understand. I mean, anyone who talks to Palestinians about understanding why Palestinians attack Israelis are going to talk about the conditions of oppression that Palestinians face. Right? It's not incidental.
It's not incidental, but there has to be some agency or onus responsibility on both sides. And like my point about disengagement in 2005, and you're saying, well, they were still there. Yeah, but my point is that in 2005 they disengaged, whether it was 20% or 90% or somewhere in between. If the smart thing for Palestinians to have done at that point was not to continue launching rockets
So
into
let's
Israel.
imagine that Palestinians elect a government that is fundamentally opposed to armed resistance against Israel, that forswears violence, and not only forswears violence, but says we want to work closely with the Israeli military to make sure that no other Palestinian groups commit acts of violence against Israel, right? We actually have seen that movie, right? Since the end of the Second Intifada, under Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority has worked very closely with the Israeli military to limit armed resistance in the West Bank. And under Salam Fayyad, right, who was the prime minister from 2007 to 2013, who was actually quite beloved among Israeli leaders and among the United States, because he worked so closely with Israel. And Salam Fayyad's position was, if we do everything possible to reassure Israel and to help make sure that Israelis stay safe, then surely we will get something from Israel in return. Israel didn't stop settlement growth for a single day. And when Salam Fayyad left politics, he said, I have been defeated. Israel never supported me. And in fact, they discredited me. And he said Hamas would grow stronger, which is exact. So that's why most Palestinians, in my experience, they don't believe that if they did the things that you are suggesting they do, that they would actually improve their circumstances.
Well,
Because
attacking is not improving it. I mean,
right?
I guess I just want to walk through a couple examples. Maybe you can help me understand these in context that you have. So,
Right.
just really quickly, final point of 2005.
Yeah.
So Israel did unilaterally withdraw. Yeah, they still had a presence there, but the action that took place in 2005 was a withdrawal of
They just changed the form of their control.
That was it. Okay.
Yes,
So how about in the 1990s? So
the military, the
so
civilian settler population, they did withdraw, but the military element, they changed the way in which they controlled Gaza militarily.
Okay, so how about in the Oslo Accord? So despite Israel making lots of concessions to the Palestinians,
what concessions?
One example was a partial self-rule through the Palestinian Authority. Despite that, terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, launched suicide bombings and other attacks. An example was 96, the Jerusalem bus bombing. That happened during an active peace process.
Yes, that's true, and it's true that Hamas committed suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks during the Oslo
Right. So
process.
you're Israel, and you see, okay, in '96, and
Right,
this year, that
right,
year, these things
right.
happen. So
But
you
again,
become a defensive state because you're
it's important,
saying,
right? I actually write quite a bit about the Oslo process in the in the book. It's important to understand what Oslo was, what the terms of Oslo were, right? The deal in Oslo was that the PLO recognized Israel, right, and forswore armed resistance, right, and and Israel recognized the PLO as a legitimate negotiating partner, the representative of the Palestinian people. The Oslo never promised Palestinians a state, nor did it promise an end to settlement growth, right? In fact, Yitzhak Rabin had never come out in support of a Palestinian state on the day he was assassinated, right? So what happens over the course of Oslo, right, is that Hamas, from the very beginning, is saying, we're suckers. This deal is a lousy deal for us. In fact, not only Hamas, Edward Said, famously, the great Palestinian intellectual, called Oslo a Palestinian Versailles because he said, look at the imbalance here. We have recognized Israel, but they have not promised us a state. They've not even stopped the settlement growth that is moving us further and further away from a state. So as settlement growth continues over the course of the 1990s, Palestinians become less and less supportive of Oslo because they feel like instead of it moving towards a state, it's moving them away from a state. And it's under those conditions that you have more Palestinian acts of violence. I think those Palestinian acts of violence were wrong, right? One of them actually took the life of a college friend of mine, right? They were fundamentally wrong. But if you want to understand why Oslo breaks down, you have to understand the conditions that were taking place.
and I guess if you're Israel, you're not acting like your compass is not okay. What is the morally right thing to do? Your priority as Israel, as the prime minister, is to survive. So when there's this,
What do you mean to survive?
it's to survive. It's to not get overrun.
You as an individual, or
The country. I'm saying if you're the prime minister of
the
Israel,
country? You mean the people?
if you're the government of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
the goal
Yeah.
is for survival. It's
The
not
survival of who?
of the people of Israel, the state of Israel.
Wait, but you mean survival of all the people under the control of the state of Israel, or some of the people?
All of them. Half of
The people are under Israeli control are Palestinian.
right.
Are you acting in a way for the people, those for them to
But
survive?
they do. The government of Israel does protect the Palestinian civilians. Now we're talking about the
The Palestinian civilians in Gaza? It doesn't seem to me to it's
I guess
that.
my final point on this was that my guess is that the goal of Israel is to survive, and if these terrorist attacks happen, regardless if Israel played a role in it, they're not thinking like the most important thing to them is not morality, it's survival. And if you have terrorists beneath you who do these things and you can explain them, Israel's just thinking we need to make these stop.
Right.
And
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think you're right. And that's why Israel responds militarily, right? And it doesn't work, right? And same reason it didn't work when the British were responding to the IRA military attacks, some of which were really awful, bombing drug department stores in London, as a military problem, because they weren't until they dealt with the underlying grievances of Catholics in Northern Ireland who weren't being treated equally. It's also the reason that the ANC, you couldn't defeat the ANC as a military problem. When people lack basic human rights, they're going to resist that oppression. You can bomb them, you can shoot them, you can imprison them, but they're going to still keep fighting you. I think the wiser way to try to create safety for everyone is to respond to the underlying grievances that people have when they don't have human freedom.
that's fair. What's the message that you want people to learn from your book that you feel like needs to be shared? Is it? I think part of it is that you don't appreciate the callousness. This is the second word I can't pronounce today.
No, you got it.
How callous people are towards Gaza, towards the suffering of Palestinians. Is that the message?
I would say beyond that, it's that I think that we have an ideology that is very prevalent in much of the Jewish world, across the world, that associates Jewish safety with Jewish supremacy. That unless Jews have legal supremacy in Israel-Palestine, Jews can't be safe. I think that's not true. I actually think that if equality is a better path to Jewish safety than Jewish supremacy, because Jewish supremacy inflicts a tremendous amount of violence on people who don't have equal rights, don't have basic human rights, and that violence ultimately endangers everybody.
Amazing. Well, Peter, thank you for the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe we could spend just 1 minute just wrapping up. And thank you.
Sure.